Quick summary of the nervous system. Okay, here we go. Here's your quick to the point lecture. Starting off, should be seeing this is on page 180 at the bottom, just as a reference point. Again, thinking about big breakdown of the nervous system. Central, just the brain and spinal cord. Peripheral has all these branches here. Big thing to think about is, again, sensory, only coming from somewhere to the brain, and motor is coming out of the brain to somewhere to do something. Autonomic is the same thing as automatic. Heart rate, blood pressure, things we don't have to think about. And then somatic is talking about voluntary movements, mainly skeletal movements. So a big thing I want to talk about too is the neuron itself. So and the cells that support it. So look at page 181. Again, that reference, that chart, the big cells that you have, you kind of got to know all of them. But if you hear neuroglia or glial cells, the GLIA cells, we're talking about these guys here, right? So if you're looking at that, you're thinking oligo. The big one though, again, the biggest, only one you can ever remember if you got to, is your astrocytes, shaped like a star, so to speak. Astrocytes make up the blood-brain barrier, help kind of be the gatekeepers to the brain, only allow certain things through from the blood vessels into the brain tissue, nutrients, those sort of things. They're the biggest, the most abundant glial cell, again, supporting cell of the nervous system. Again, nervous system just has neurons and then all these guys, the neuroglia or glial cells. And also the word glial cells, I didn't mention this. Glial cells kind of comes from the word like Greek word glue. Glial is G. Glue, the glue that binds the nervous system together. That's your glial cells. Glue binds the nervous system together. Okay. The book mentions that as well. Glial is the means glue. It's in the book. So astrocytes, the most abundant one we have, make up the blood-brain barrier. These guys here, these are your cells that make up the myelin sheaths. Swan cells for your peripheral nervous system. Oligodendrocytes for the central nervous system. These are form your myelin sheaths of your axons of the cell. And again, the difference between these two is mainly that these are found mainly in central nervous system. These are found mainly PNS, the peripheral nervous system. Difference is that when there's an injury in the central nervous system, because there's only one nucleus from multiple axons, it's hard for them to regrow. The Swan cells make it easier for peripheral nervous system neurons to regrow. Other ones, you've got your epididymal cells. These line the spinal cord and the ventricles. They have to do with movement of CSF and production of CSF. And then the other guy that kind of gets forgotten about is called microglia. Not my favorite name, but phagocytosis. It's the hanging out in the nervous system to eat stuff that's not supposed to be there, right? Okay. So moving on, and just kind of remember that blood-brain barrier discussion at the body of work section and the body of work section on that same page on 180, or the life lesson section on that same page on 181 talks about brain tumors. Most brain tumors are known as gliomas because, again, they're known as gliomas again because, right, they are discussing they're known as gliomas because brain tumors respond or are going to come from these cells, because these cells multiply. Neurons stay around for a long time. These guys multiply often, and they're more likely to become cancerous. That's where they become gliomas, brain tumors. Okay, looking again is a kind of a reference point too, guys, right? You want to, sorry, I'm making sure I'm doing this right. Yep. So you want to make the reference point for neurons too, that there's 3 stages, right? You've got your sensory here, sensory neurons, aka your, which ones? A for afferent neurons. Interneurons are connecting all those. And again, you've got your efferent neurons, E here, okay, or your motor neurons. These guys, right, are coming down from the brain. So the signal always goes sensory afferent neurons with an A are always taking a signal to the brain interneurons and the spinal cord interconnecting, and then the signal gets sent out through motor neurons. Again, whether that's moving my hand or making sure my heart beats, all that stuff, that signal is coming from somewhere. It's coming from the brain out. Motor's always efferent, making an effort, something's happening, always going out. Okay. So with that too, kind of referencing, we want to make sure and reference the actual neuron itself, its structure. Again, big components. You've got your cell body here with the dendrites. That's one side. You got your axon down to this guy here, which is technically known as the synaptic knob, but you have to imagine that this is only like a one-way path. Okay. So this means that if you imagine that this is a peripheral nerve that keeps going, this section, if this was to another nerve, is going to connect to the dendrite of another neuron. And here's its axon there. So cell body with a nucleus, dendrite, axon. The path is going this way. Okay. So for example, if this is a sensory neuron, the sensation's happening here and moving up, ascending. If you remember ascending, descending, ascending up to, again, this is upside down to that, but it would be up towards our brain. If this was the opposite, if this was, say, a motor neuron or something like that, say this is a somatic, this would be like a muscle, this is a neuromuscular junction, and the signal's coming down from the brain to this guy here, okay? Like that. Again, that's the pathway of the neurons. So main structures, again, axon. We have our myelin sheaths here. These are all Schwann cells because they're individual with individual nucleus and neurolemma. So want to remember that. These are the big point there is that these, again, neurolemma helps them regenerate because they each have a nucleus that can kind of help. If this gets severed like this, right through there, they can help regenerate by being a spot for the neuron to grow back to its attachment point. Along with that, our myelin sheaths speed up impulse conduction, increase the speed, right? And give for the electrical impulse and their protection for injury and general stuff that could be happening along that path. So that's the big stuff there. Again, don't worry about that. This picture's on 183. Don't worry about the types of neurons on 182 at the bottom, like bipolar, multipolar, all that. Don't worry about that stuff. Okay. So moving forward, let's talk about mainly. I want to talk about that's the most thing with that. I'm going to jump to the brain, but this also goes for the spinal cord and gray matter and white matter. Okay. Remember, so this is kind of showing gray matter here. Inside would be white matter, opposite for spinal cord, but that doesn't matter. Focus on the fact that white equals myelin. So basically, all this is saying is that white matter is composed of higher densities, higher amounts of myelin. The gray appears gray because it lacks the same amount of myelin. That's all you really need to know. Okay. It's just about concentration of myelin. Don't stress about that in general. The other thing that takes place in this picture is the layers of the meninges. Again, meninges, that M word, meninges is layers. Again, that is taking place. Meninges is around the spinal cord and around the brain. Okay. So same concept. So kind of showing here, if you're kind of looking at this picture in general, and this picture takes place on page, 198 in your book, 198. So, but on this picture is the same thing as spinal cord, same layer. So the innermost layer, the layer that's on the brain tissue and on the spinal cord itself, touching it, is your pia mater, the most close. So pia mater. Then you've got this guy that's colored purple here. That's the next layer up. Again, arachnoid matter with an A. Okay. And then the strong, durable layer that touches the skull in this case, or on the most outside for the spine. Okay. And that is the dura mater, durable outside layer. That's supposed to be a D. Forgive me. D, dura mater. Okay. And you can think about this part is showing you, again, if you look at your book, it's showing you the spaces in between. And that's talking about if there's bleeding or fluid buildup or those sort of things. But just make sure you know the layers. Durable, outside layer, arachnoid in the middle, pia mater is touching the membrane itself, or touching the tissue itself. In this case, the brain tissue on the spine, it's touching the spinal cord itself. Okay. And remember, again, with the brain, especially, we've only got, the bone stops us having room. This bone here is hard. It's not going to expand. So if we have fluid buildup, like excess cerebral spinal fluid that's talked about on page 199 at the body of work, and also that process with extra fluid on the brain at the bottom of that page known as hydrocephalus, right? If we have that, we've got a little bit of a problem, right? We got no room. We can push up against the skull, but we're not going to go anywhere. So that means that pressure of fluid is going to push down on certain parts of the brain here, like this, and cause issues, whatever that is, whatever tissues is affecting. So also kind of keep that in mind. All right, moving on, we're going to get into like the actual brain again. I also wanted to mention, if you go back, we're going to backtrack. I kind of skipped over it. I didn't mean to. With the spine stuff, big two kind of disease process with the spine to think of is kind of backtracking a bit is multiple sclerosis. That's talked about on page 188. MS, again, is a disease process that affects myelin and the myelin sheaths. So therefore decreasing or weakening impulse conduction, therefore, i.e. weakness, loss of coordination, loss of balance, muscle weakness, things like that. It's going to be the problem you see in multiple sclerosis over time. And right now it's untreatable, but that's what MS is. Same thing talking about the spine on page 193. It's good to look at. Spinal meningitis can be viral or bacterial, but anytime you hear itis, anything, you think inflammation or infection or both, because they usually coincide sometimes. You think both. So just think meningitis, you think some kind of spinal infection, and the symptoms for that, the big stuff, fever. Okay. Usually abnormally high fever, but high fever. Okay. Stiff neck. They can't turn their head left or right, like in a no pattern. Irritability / headache / drowsiness is all kind of there. Those are your like big symptoms: headache, drowsiness. You're going to be irritable because you have a headache. That's spinal meningitis. You don't necessarily have to know that viral is more treatable than bacterial, and bacterial is more infectious, but that's irrelevant for you guys. Just think spinal meningitis, have an idea of those symptoms. Okay. That's the biggest thing I want you to think about. So looking at some other stuff here. Let's see, let's drive into the brain. So again, brain, kind of the big discussion about the brain starts on page 201. So, or well, it's mainly 201 starts about division. The big structure is on 197. This sort of image here. Remember, we've got some big portions here. This part is showing that there are two hemispheres, right? A left and a right hemisphere. They're joined by a bundle of nerves here. You remember that bundle of nerves names? Corpus callosum joins these two hemispheres. And then you imagine these big sections, right? They mirror each other on each hemisphere, excuse me. So your big guy here, the whole big brain thing with all its ridges that are unique to you was what? Starts with a C, right? Cerebrum. I'm not gonna be able to spell it very well. This guy on top of right here, this guy is your diencephalon. I'm just gonna put a D here, or put di. Well, that's not really a good D. Diencephalon, and then this whole structure here, right? We know what that is. Has three parts. They're labeled here, but brain stem, and then the bell that hangs off the back or looks like a walnut or something chestnut. I'm not familiar with my nuts. Cerebellum, right? Those are your big structures, okay? So moving on to kind of look at that, we want to talk about break down the structures themselves. That would be the other part of this. So again, brainstem, big things you want to think here. This, you can ignore this. This is just showing us where that's at. Here's your brainstem, three parts of the brainstem. You've got, and this is talked about on page 190, or excuse me, 201. 201 discusses the brainstem. Again, midbrain here, this guy, midbrain is on the top of the brainstem. Sensory and nerve impulses come through here. Lots of sensory and nerve impulses go through there. It also has auditory and visual reflexes, again, like reflexes responding to light and that sort of thing. More autonomic nervous system components happen through here, like stuff we don't have to think about. We don't have thought processes. Very just kind of happens. The pons down here in the middle is a site that several of our cranial nerves start at. You can kind of see them showing them here. Cranial nerves start at here. Again, this is the pons, and several cranial nerves come out of there. And also it's a track for, again, conveying signals to different parts of the brain. So this kind of has its function with kind of not filtering, but sensory and motor impulses run through here. This is kind of like filtering switchboard to other parts of the brain here from the pons. And then the medulla, again, is like your living center, your vital function center. Okay, so the medulla oblongata here has got mainly, again, think of vital functions. Cardiac center, vasomotor is what the book lists, again, vascular control, and respiratory centers help regulate breathing. Okay, that's the big things I want you to get from that. All right, I'm going to keep moving on here. Other parts of the brain we want to talk about. Again, cerebellum, real quick. I'm not even going to write anything. Cerebellum is a bell that hangs off the back, posterior portion of the head. Cerebellum is talked about on page. I jumped around, but talked about. I jumped around. Whoops. Talked about on the bottom of page 201 still, and that's basically its big role is balance, coordination, posture, body movements. Okay, a little bit of perception and a little bit of sound, but big things is balance, coordination. So issues here, you think balance, coordination, loss of those kind of things, right? Okay. Let's go ahead and jump to this guy. So remember what this is, this section that rides on top of our brainstem, that's the diencephalon, and it has two components. The diencephalon has the thalamus and the hypothalamus, okay? Again, thalamus, you think filter with TH, right? The thalamus filters it's like a gateway, filters out pretty much nearly every sensory impulse we see in our body: smell, sight, taste, pain, pressure, heat, all the stuff. It gets filtered through there. The thalamus kind of helps decide, should my brain react to this heat? Should it react to this pressure? Should it react to this? And sends that information on to the proper place. But it's kind of not a processing, like it doesn't do any understanding here. It just gets the signal and sends it out. Hypothalamus controls a lot of homeostasis with endocrine control, which means hormone control is the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is, it also kind of regulates, helps regulate temperature and other stuff. But you think body homeostasis and hormone control, hypothalamus. Okay. So the big part here that we want to talk about too is the big section of breaking down. Again, this is your cerebrum, the big part of your brain, the whole big part, its structures and why we care about what they do. Again, this is on page 203. And when you're studying this, think about, again, relating it to the life lesson section at the bottom, the brain lesions. It kind of helps you figure out what if something's wrong here, what's the big key thing. So frontal lobe here, this whole purple section, right? Voluntary movement, is one thing, but the big thing is like social judgment, emotion, decision making, reasoning, and aggression. And a lot of so those are all aspects that make up somebody's personality, right? Reasoning, decision making, social judgment. So if an injury here, I may have a change in personality, aggression, lack of inhibition. I may have a total personality change. That's your frontal lobe. Okay, we'll go here. Parietal lobe with a P is this whole bluish teal section here. Parietal with a P, again, look at that section down there. Parietal, you think of probably you think of sensations, such touch, temperature, pressure. It's kind of interpreting those interpretations. It's getting those interpretations from somewhere else, but it's getting those signals from probably the thalamus, but the parietal lobe is who does most of that interpreting of that. And also P for proprioceptors, P for parietal. Proprioceptors help us determine where our body is in the world. So parietal lobe kind of helps do that. So if I have an injury in the parietal lobe somewhere, I could lose awareness that I have a whole left arm and leg or something like that. That's rare, but that's what we're talking about. It has an awareness of our body being somewhere. Okay. Occipital lobe in the back. Again, these are named for the bones that are underneath. Pretty easy visual information. It's about interpreting. Again, the signal gets there from somewhere else, but the interpretation of what we see happens here mostly. Okay. There is always overlap, right? This guy here is right by the ear and it's right underneath the temporal bone. So this is the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe's main jobs, it's going to be this hearing, smell, some learning and some memory. But big thing is hearing, smell, and visual recognition. Again, recognizing that what a coffee cup is for. It's a coffee cup. I drink out of it. I may see the coffee cup and have that analyzed by the occipital lobe, but knowing what it is and what to do with it happens here, along with hearing, smell, learning, and some memory. And then the last big section of the cerebrum is hiding here underneath these two is the insula. And that is your basic emotions, insula with an I, basic emotions, and kind of the addiction center, like awareness and control, like self-control and those kind of things. That's addiction. So that's what they kind of think that is. And again, you can kind of look at a lesion there, what it might cause. Okay. Last part I want to touch on is just the big other section of this is that parasympathetic discussion. And I necessarily don't have the biggest thing. Again, go to 214 and look at divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Again, That's down that branch, right? We're talking about autonomic nervous system. So we're talking about this branch here, right? Autonomic, we're talking about sympathetic and parasympathetic. So autonomic just means we don't automatic, we don't regulate it. So again, remember that 95% of the time, whatever the percentage is, parasympathetic is the normal operating daily function of us as people. We're digesting food, we're relaxed, we're doing some things. So parasympathetic is calming, the decreasing heart rate. It constricts bronchial tubes to decrease flow of lungs because we don't need to breathe deep. We don't need a lot of flow. Stimulates intestines to be have increased intestinal motility, so our intestines move better. All those sort of things. Okay. So the opposite effect is sympathetic. Sympathetic is this is your rest and digest is parasympathetic. Uh, Fight or flight is sympathetic, meaning I'm getting ready to fight or I'm getting ready to flee or run. So increase alertness because of norepinephrine, the adrenaline hormone, but also that means increased heart rate, dilating bronchial tubes. So we let more air in to our lungs, sweat glands, and then slows down our GI motility, slows down our intestinal tract. So, we don't poop ourselves, right? Okay. So that is the big summary. So that was the quick and dirty of all the big stuff from this chapter. Okay. And so hopefully that summed it up somewhat okay for you guys. And good luck studying. You guys can do this, parse it out, make sure that you're taking your time with this, and make sure you're reading for comprehension when you are reading. You guys got this.